Chapter 6. Silcock. We spent the following night reloading the forward torpedo tubes. This operation was always a difficult one due to the cramped space in the torpedo rooms. The massive 21-inch diameter weapons had to be hoisted up from their tie-down racks and slid forward into the launching tubes. The process is easier when the bow is pointed downwards, at least for the forward tubes, so we trimmed the boat to allow gravity to accommodate the process. None of the off-duty crew slept much that night because they had to constantly hold on to their bunks lest they slide off and land on the floor. The guys who slept in the forward torpedo room couldn't even lay down because their bunks had to be folded up out of the way to allow the torpedoes to be moved forward. The next afternoon our bridge watch spotted a smoke plume to the east. We immediately gave chase, but frequent air alarms greatly hindered our pursuit. The enemy must have known we were in the area, because the furiously zigzagging freighter was circled overhead by a continuous air patrol. Finally, after sundown, the buzzards were compelled to return to base. It was now or never. We fired a double salvo of torpedoes, but a fortuitous zag taken by the ship at the exact wrong moment caused both to miss. Our prey, speeding along at more than 12 knots, disappeared into the darkness. We spent another couple of hours during the night once again reloading the empty torpedo tubes. There was also a dangerous leak in the port ballast tank valve that needed to be repaired. And if that wasn't enough, we were repeatedly forced to dive because of air alerts. It was obvious the enemy's airborne radar was now effective enough to deny us our traditional cover of night. The swarm of enemy planes over our heads was so heavy that when running on the surface, we ourselves were forced to steer a zigzag course in order to lessen the chance of a surprise bomb hit from the air. It was embarrassing to have to zigzag like a scared little freighter, but better safe than sorry. Looking back with the advantage of hindsight, it is clear that the Allies were aware of our every move. We didn't fully realize it at the time, but the entire tide of the war in the Atlantic had turned decisively against our U-boats. First of all, the buildup of enemy air forces had made our previous tactics totally ineffective. Gone were the days when we could maneuver primarily on the surface and dive only when conducting an attack or escaping. The Metox device still warned us in time to avoid most air attacks, but once we were forced under water, our speed was insufficient to catch all but the slowest of ships. By forcing us to remain submerged, the Allies had turned our U-boats into little more than slow-moving minefields, dangerous to their ships only if they happened to blunder across our path. Given the enemy's elaborate radio direction-finding efforts, it was easy for the Allies to reroute their convoys around us. Once the convoys were safe, the bombers and destroyers would descend upon us like packs of jackals. As important as the technological race was, however, it wasn't the only factor. Once the Allies cracked our top-secret Enigma cipher system, they were able to read almost every communication between our boats and headquarters. Another important factor, which we didn't learn about until long after the war, was the treachery of Admiral Canaris, the head of our nation's military intelligence service. Canaris, one of the greatest traitors of World War II, was responsible for sending many of our comrades to their deaths. Today, I harbor no animosity for our former enemies, the British and Americans, but I can never forgive Canaris for his bloody-handed betrayal of his fellow countrymen. With knowledge of our operational orders, combined with their burgeoning numbers, the enemy gradually moved from their strategic defense to the strategic offense in the Battle of the Atlantic. Our massed wolf pack attacks against enemy convoys, which should have reaped us tremendous harvests of tonnage, became instead opportunities for the enemy to overwhelm and sink our boats. Of course, we had no way of knowing any of this at the time. But one thing was crystal clear. The happy time for Germany's U-boats was over. Our experience in U-505 was mirroring the wider strategic picture. Because of the intense air activity over our heads, Kapitän Lieutenant Czech decided to flee from the area as quickly as feasible. As soon as repairs on our ballast tank were complete, we attempted to make a run for it. We didn't get far. Virtually every time we surfaced to use our diesels, the Metox device would sound the alarm that a radar-equipped enemy plane was stalking us. All day long we played the old roller coaster game of surfacing to run the diesels and recharge batteries, only to find that we must once again dive to escape air attack. In this regard, the Metox was proving to be a mixed blessing. True, it protected us from surprise, but because the mechanism was unable to measure the distance of enemy signals, we could not distinguish between attacking aircraft from those merely passing by at long range. As a result, every enemy radar contact forced us to emergency dive. The constant alarms jangled our nerves, exhausted our bodies, and prevented our boat from fully replenishing our air supply and recharging our battery power. During this period, on the night of November 9th to be specific, I was on duty in the control room of U-505, bemoaning the fact that the air alerts had once again robbed me of my chance to eat supper. At exactly midnight, our chief navigator, Alfred Reinig, crawled through the control room hatch and walked over to my station. He stopped in front of me, grabbed my hand, and began shaking it vigorously. "Congratulations, Hans. Today you are 19, right?" I had forgotten it was my birthday. "Jawohl, Herr Obersteuermann," I stammered. "Come on, Hans, stop calling me chief, especially since we've been working so well together for the past year. Besides, who knows where we will be in another year?" With a broad smile and a pat on my back, Reinig retreated back through the hatch to his bunk. I wished he had never reminded me about my birthday. Homesickness washed over me like a big green ocean wave. The calendar might say that I was a year older, but I felt more childlike and lonely at that moment than at any time in my life. Another Metox alarm shook me from my reverie. I wanted to scream, laugh, and cry all at the same time. Eventually, anger won out. I sat at my station, sullenly going through the diving operations, blaming the British for robbing us of our chance to enjoy a normal life. To my great annoyance, word soon spread throughout the boat that it was my birthday. More backslaps and handshakes. My birthday present from the officers on this special day was permission to stand watch on the bridge for an hour to get some fresh air. My friend Tony found a bottle of Beck's beer, which had mistakenly been loaded with the ship's galley stores. We shared it together. I was grateful for such good friends, but I couldn't stop thinking about what the navigator had said. Who knows where we will be in another year? The uninterrupted cycle of surfacing to recharge batteries, only to immediately dive again to escape an attack from the air, continued throughout the next day. In desperation, Czech resorted to a full-speed underwater run in an attempt to shake loose from our airborne tormentors. Around noon, we finally got a break from the buzzards and were able to surface without molestation. To the west was the coast of Trinidad, so close we could smell the sweet, spicy fragrance of tropical flowers in bloom. Above us, a thick layer of clouds obscured the sun, bathing us in cool shadows. The gorgeous turquoise water gently lapped against our hull. It was the quiet before the storm. Second watch officer Stolzenburg, standing watch on the bridge with the skipper, was worried. It was suspicious enough that the swarm of enemy airplanes, which had been so numerous the previous day, had mysteriously disappeared. What made it worse was the blanket of dark gray clouds, so low they seemed to be scraping the top of his cap. Conditions like these were what Kapitänleutnant Löwe used to call perfect air attack weather. Czech had been even grouchier than usual these past few days, but Stolzenburg could not restrain himself any longer. Something in the back of his head told him we were in danger. "Sir, may I suggest that we double the bridge watch in order to guard against surprise air attack?" Czech turned to the watch officer and gave him a disdainful smirk. "No need to get nervous, Stolzenburg. The Metax will give us ample warning of any planes." Despite the icy sarcasm in Czech's voice, Stolzenburg wasn't ready to give up. "Sir, don't you think we should at least trim down the boat so we can make an alarm dive quicker?" Kapitänleutnant Löwe used to say. At the mere mention of our previous skipper's name, Czech exploded into one of his famous rages, reminding the stunned watch officer at the top of his voice, as if any of us needed reminding, that he was the skipper now, not Löwe. Satisfied he had reasserted his authority over his inferior, Czech swaggered off the bridge and returned to his cabin. Within minutes, gossip regarding Czech's latest temper tantrum was making its rounds throughout the boat. I was on duty in the control room, and I spent the next couple of hours trying not to draw attention from any of the officers. They had picked up on the Kapitänleutnant's mood and were trying to imitate it in order to stay out of trouble themselves. Things remained quiet until about 14 hours, when suddenly the siren for manning the anti-aircraft guns began to blare. Almost simultaneously, the shrill alarm signaling an emergency dive sounded. We all looked at each other in puzzlement, because the orders were contradictory. How could we man the deck guns while at the same time submerge? Just a few heartbeats later, before we had sorted out the situation, we heard the unmistakable roar of aircraft engines resonating through the hull of our boat. I unconsciously ducked my head at the sound, instinctively aware of how close the aircraft must be for us to hear its engine above the hammering of our own diesels. Suddenly, a deafening blast, 1,000 times louder than a thunderclap, knocked us off our feet. It felt as if a giant fist had slammed the boat down into the water. A split second later, 3 more explosions ripped through the air, even louder than the first. Our boat's steel hull rang like a cathedral bell from the concussions. This time the shock waves pushed our boat upward, sending anyone still standing after the first blast sailing through the air. One of the men who was standing watch on the bridge, a petty officer, was blown by the force of the first blast through the top hatch and down into the conning tower. The second set of blasts rolled his bloody, unconscious body down through the control room hatch, where he fell and landed on his head on the steel deck in front of me. Inside the boat was pure pandemonium. The lights had gone out, and the air was suddenly filled with thick, acrid smoke. When the emergency lights finally came on, it unveiled a scene straight from Dante's Inferno, complete with screams and burning noxious fumes. Shouts from the aft end of the boat told us that there was a large breach in the hull. A thick jet of seawater was pouring into the boat, filling the diesel bilge and flooding the engine room. Someone reported that the depth meter indicated that water was weighing the boat down. Translation: we were sinking. I cannot possibly begin to describe what it was like inside the boat at that moment, nor can I describe my emotional state. Never in my life had I felt such an irresistible urge to escape, to climb, crawl, and if need be, claw my way up the conning tower ladder to the sun and fresh air of the surface. Something, however, held me back, and I refused to succumb to the animalistic desire within to run. Perhaps it was my training, or professional pride, or perhaps it was just a childish fear of being called a coward. Whatever it was, I somehow overcame the primal desire to escape. Despite our desperate situation, a steely determination to do our duty and fight to save our boat quickly spread unspoken from crewman to crewman. None of us deserted our post. Not everyone, however, was so determined to stay on board. Captain Lieutenant Czech came running through the control room and clambered up the ladders to the bridge. What he saw must have really scared him, because after just a moment topside he shouted down to the control room the order to abandon ship. We all froze at our posts, unable or unwilling to obey the order. But when the command to abandon ship reached the next compartment, our Diesel Chief Petty Officer Otto Fricke stormed like a mad bull into the control room. With anger and defiance in his voice, he shouted up to Czech, "Well, you can do what you want, but the technical crew is staying on board to keep her afloat." With a scowl of disgust, Fricke turned around and ran back to the engine room to take command of the damage control effort. The expression on Czech's face gradually turned from fear to confusion, and then to embarrassment. "All right, then, do what you can," he murmured, long after the chief had left the compartment. Within a few minutes the engineering crew had plugged the hole in the hull with a rubber sheet, shored against the water pressure with a long piece of timber. Luckily, the main pump was still working, so despite numerous leaks all along the length of the port diesel engine, the water gradually stopped rising in the engine room. By switching the air supply for the starboard diesel to the interior of the boat, Fricke was able to suck the suffocating smoke out of the boat. We all thanked heaven for our clever chief and his brave boys in the engineering crew. With the most immediate danger averted, we were finally able to take a look topside. We couldn't believe the sight that greeted us. Now we realized why Czech had given the order to abandon ship. Our boat had been nearly blown in two by the surprise air attack. The wooden planks of the upper deck aft of the conning tower looked as if a bulldozer had plowed across them. In the center of the damage, an enormous hole gaped halfway across the entire topside hull of the boat, exposing a jumble of smashed and broken equipment below. Our 37mm anti-aircraft gun had been blown completely overboard by the force of the blasts, its mounting bolts sheared off as cleanly as if cut by a razor. Fully half of the steel side plates of the conning tower were either gone or hanging limply, clanging against each other in time with the gentle rocking of the waves. One depth charge, or bomb, at that point we weren't sure which, had exploded on the pressurized tubes where the spare torpedoes were stored, completely destroying one of the torpedoes except for the warhead section. If that torpedo warhead had gone off, none of us would have survived. Despite the enormous damage to the conning tower, Lieutenant Ensign Stolzenburg and the other two men standing watch on the bridge were still alive. They were laying unconscious on the bridge deck, drenched in seawater and their own blood. Stolzenburg was badly wounded and bleeding heavily from the shrapnel wounds in his head and back. The mystery of why we had not suffered another bombing attack was obvious. Floating just 30 meters off our starboard bow was the scattered wreckage of a large enemy aircraft. The mutilated body of one of its crewmen was sprawled lifelessly across the fragment of a wing. After a few moments the wing sank, taking the man's body down with it. The aircraft had been destroyed by the blast of its own depth charges. We didn't have time to think about the death of the enemy flyer or our good fortune. We were much too busy fighting to keep ourselves afloat. Only many years after the attack did I discover exactly what happened to us that day. According to Gaylord Kelshaw's excellent book, The U-Boat War in the Caribbean, the aircraft that attacked us was a Lockheed Hudson, number PZ/L, one of the big two-engined bombers the British Coastal Command operated out of Trinidad's Edinburgh airfield on anti-submarine patrols. The pilot of the aircraft was Flight Sergeant Ronald Silcock, a veteran Australian aviator generally regarded as the top submarine hunter in No. 53 Squadron. Silcock and his seasoned multinational aircrew had already scored hits against two other U-boats in recent weeks. In one attack he heavily damaged Capitaine Lieutenant Peening's U-155 off the coast of Martinique. Just a few days later, Silcock once again demonstrated his superb bombing accuracy by attacking and nearly sinking Schweichel's U-173. It was said that Silcock, using the Hudson's unique depth charge spreading device to maximum effectiveness, had never missed a target. The flight sergeant's fabulous success was based on a bombing tactic he personally developed, one that neatly turned our increasing reliance on the Metox radar warning device to his advantage. Over the course of several days, the crafty Silcock would repeatedly patrol the suspected location of a U-boat using his ASV airborne search radar turned on, pinpointing the sub's position but not attacking. This lulled the sub into a false sense of security by leading it to believe that its Metox would be 100% reliable in warning of any plane in the vicinity. Then, when cloudy conditions limited the ability of German lookouts to spot the approach of his aircraft, Silcock would patrol the boat's location with his radar turned off. Once his lookouts had visually spotted the U-boat, Silcock would dive out of the sun with his engines feathered, silently and invisibly gliding down towards his target like a giant hawk. At the last minute he would turn his engines on again, drop his bomb load, and pull out of the dive. Sadly for Silcock and his crew, this time his aim was too perfect. The direct hit on our aft deck directed the force of the depth charge's blast upward, blowing his aircraft to pieces. His tactics had worked perfectly, but the sub-hunting ace had become a victim of his own skill. During the course of our repair efforts on U-505, we found several pieces of bright yellow duraluminum from Silcock's aircraft scattered on our deck. Later, our machinist used the scrap metal to make little axes, our boat's symbol ever since our days under Capitaine Lieutenant Löwe, for us crewmen to affix to our caps. This was in no way a demonstration of disrespect for the crew of the aircraft that had nearly killed us. Like so many men during World War II, they had to pay with their lives for doing their duty for their country. We respected them for that, and indeed were filled with great admiration for their skill and courage. In 1998, I visited Trinidad and placed flowers at a U-boat memorial there, not only in memory of my fallen comrades in the U-boat service, but also for the brave and able crew of that Hudson. Every year since our encounter with Silcock, I celebrate my birthday on 2 days, on my true birthday and on the anniversary of the day that we so miraculously escaped death at the hands of the courageous flight sergeant. And the little yellow aluminum axe made from Silcock's plane? I still have it, as a talisman of luck and remembrance.